G'day, how you doing? Adam Williams here from Adam Williams Creative. We've got a great day today. I'm really excited about this. We have Steve Arnold. I give luminosity masks a hard time sometimes, don't I? I have done in the past. But today, Steve Arnold is going to tell us why luminosity masks are incredible and how they can speed up our workflow and, help us to create incredible images. So that's going to be a lot of fun. What do you think of the pink shirt? What do you think of the pink shirt? Big shout out to Jan. I called Jan Jane yesterday. Sorry about that, Jan. Jan and Tom Putt have conspired to send this up. And in actual fact, this was once upon a time a white shirt. And Jan has dyed it pink, especially for me, so I can have my own pink shirt. I think it looks pretty good. It's a little bit tight, but shows off my ordinary physique. Anyway, we should get onto it. Little bit of housekeeping here. As we go through today, fire me some questions and I'll pass them on to Steve if you've got anything that you would like to ask. I'm just tidying up over here. 1 second so I can see my notes. Okay, Steve, luminosity mask expert. Been teaching Photoshop and luminosity masking for 7 years already. Thousands of students. He has thousands and thousands of subscribers on YouTube. Have a look in the description below. His YouTube channel is there. He has over 100 videos on luminosity masking on Photoshop. Give him a subscribe and thank him for coming today. He has a layers and mask video over there that has 1 point something or other million views. He has nearly 3 million views total, I think, something like that. Absolute top bloke, one of my good mates. I've known Steve for a long time. Let's bring him on. Let's switch the cameras here. Where are we? All right, Steve, how you doing? You're on camera. You need to behave yourself now. Your microphone should be working. How you doing, mate?
Yeah, g'day, Ed. Yeah, doing great. Thanks for having us on. It's it's a real privilege to be here. This is actually my first ever live YouTube video. So nice. I think I was watching one of yours the other day and you said that something usually goes wrong at least once. So you've got the right guest here if you want to keep that up.
Well, to be honest, occasionally the technology drops out, but most of the time it's me creating the issues. But let's see. So far, so good. Hopefully it all works out. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, mate. And where am I? I'm not on that camera, on this camera now. Guys, as I said, have a look in the description below. In actual fact, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but Steve's YouTube channel is down there. Give that a subscribe as a thank you. But there is also going to be an incredible offer on Steve's got a luminosity mask / Photoshop action panel, which is really, really awesome. He showed me it yesterday. And there's also a deal down there about that. But don't worry about that just for now because Steve's going to show us that panel a little bit later on and it's really, really cool. All right, Steve, I'll leave you with it. If I get any questions from the guys here, I'll just jump in and shoot them to you as we're going, if that's okay.
Sounds great. Yeah, let's crack on. All right, so obviously Adam's brought me here to talk about luminosity masking. I'm going to kind of wind it all back to absolute basics just to begin with, just to get anyone up to speed who's not familiar really with even what it is. So so everyone's familiar with layer masks, like in general. So the concept of adding a layer mask to an image to either conceal or reveal a layer or an adjustment, and using a black or white brush in the layer mask to do that. So where luminosity masking comes in, it's basically a way of creating a more defined layer mask by brushing through a luminosity selection. So what we're going to actually walk through is probably technically more to do with luminosity selections to create masks. The term luminosity masks gets used most frequently, but it's actually more about the selections that we're creating to create those masks. So let's just run through a real quick demo to sort of build up to understanding what a luminosity selection and mask is. So I've got, okay, so the best analogy that I have kind of thought of to explain how this works is the idea of using a stencil to brush through. So if you imagine you've got a regular stencil with letters and numbers, and you want to spray paint a wall with those letters and numbers, you would just like, let's just use the selection tool here just to create a really basic shape. And then we take a brush, and this selection is going to work in exactly the same way as a stencil with a can of spray paint would. So if I brush outside of this shape, then nothing's happening. And as soon as I move inside, we can see the paint is being applied. So where luminosity selections are different is that there's actually a third dimension to them, not just up and down or on the X or Y axis. There's actually a depth to them. So to help us understand that, here's an image of a lace curtain. I actually grew up calling them net curtains, but when I Googled this image, I found out they were called lace curtains anyway. So if you imagine using a lace curtain as your stencil that you want to spray a can of paint through, the pattern is going to define how much paint actually hits the wall. So you've got, thicker parts of the lace is going to block more of the paint. Thinner parts is going to let more through. And as a result, the pattern is going to be, it's going to appear on the wall based on how thick and how thin each section is. So a luminosity selection in Photoshop is essentially exactly the same thing. The key point is that the pattern is created by the brightness of the pixels in the image itself. So let's just run through how we can actually load a selection. So this was just our two-dimensional selection. So now let's load a luminosity selection and do the same kind of example. So here's an image. This is a finished image, and we're just going to use this for a couple of examples, and then just as a sneak peek, we're going to do some exposure blending with this image in a little while. So luminosity selections are all built in the channels panel in Photoshop. So I think it must be by default because this is where it's always been, right next to the layers panel. But if you don't have the channels panel, or if you can't find it in your workspace, you can just find it from the window menu. And well, I'll just run through the steps to create our first stencil, let's say. All we're going to do on the keyboard is hold Command or Control. So Command if you're on a Mac, Control on a PC, and click the RGB channel once. And you'll notice a selection, like we've got all these marching ants to show us that a selection is now active. So this is actually a luminosity selection. This is a first luminosity selection. However, because these marching ants are only two-dimensional, we can't really get a good feel for what we're actually selecting. So what I like to do, even if we don't necessarily need to do this at this stage, what I like to do is save this selection as a channel, which you can do right down here with this icon, save selection as channel. And that will create an alpha 1 channel. So what we have here is basically at this stage, it's just a black and white version of your image, where the brightest parts of the image are lighter, obviously, and the darker parts are darker. So now, let me just deselect that. Now, in order to, well, for this to work in that net curtain analogy, the only difference between what we're looking at here and using this as our stencil and using the net curtain is that net curtains are usually white. So all we have to do is just invert the net curtain to basically replicate what we're seeing here. So now the darkest parts of this net curtain are the thickest parts. So they're going to block more of the spray paint that we're painting through it. So in here, when we look at the alpha 1 channel we created, that's exactly what's going on here. So if we load this now as a selection, and then brush through that selection onto, well, let's do an example onto an empty layer. So I'm just going to create a new layer there and fill it with white. Now let's come back to the Alpha 1 channel. And actually there's something funny going on here, hang on. So yeah, if we now load the Alpha 1 channel as a selection again, just by holding on the keyboard again, Command or Control, we get those marching ants to show that the selection is active. We can come back into the image here. And if we take, I've got a blue brush selected, and yeah, this slight red tint that we're seeing here is just the mask being shown. I think I've clicked something, I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly what I've done to get rid of, or how to get rid of that right now.
Steve, try / or backslash might get rid of that. The one that's up above the enter or return key is the quick select. No, not doing it.
No, I think something funny's happened between my... there we go. Got rid. I normally, I just click between layers and layer masks and it goes away. So, all right, let's come back. So we'll load this Alpha 1 channel as a selection. So Command or Control, click on the Alpha 1 channel. Come back over here into the empty layer. We'll take this blue brush, and I've got the blue brush is on 100% opacity. So what we're expecting to see here, because the brighter parts of the image are white in the channel, it's going to block less of the spray paint, whereas the shadows down here is going to block more. So we can see that's happening here. These dark rocks are barely being made visible because that's what the stencil is restricting our brushstroke to. But if I go through the middle in the water in here, which was very bright, we can see that more of the paint is making it through that selection. So in essence, that is brushing through a luminosity selection. And so luminosity masking just becomes, what can we do with this technique of brushing through a selection? Most often we brush through the selection into a layer mask, hence why it's luminosity masking. So just one more thing before we actually use a practical example, actually doing something on this image that's going to be useful rather than painting a dodgy white, blue and white thing. So back in the channels panel, and let's have a look at our Alpha 1 channel again. So this is a highlight, well, it's a highlight selection. It's technically a channel, but just think of it as the selection. So I'll just call that H1 because that's the first level of highlights that have been isolated. In order to create the same thing, but to isolate the shadows, all we have to do, we could do it on this actual channel, but let's duplicate it by dragging it down here onto the new channel icon. Let's call this one S for shadows, S1. All we have to do is on keyboard, Command or Control I to invert it. So now the darkest parts of the image are white, which means if we load this as a selection and then brush through that selection, the brush is going to be applied more in the shadows than in the highlights. So all of the grays in the image that are kind of between pure black and pure white, they're kind of, it's like a gradation. It's going to apply some of the paint, but not all. And that's based on whether it's a dark or a light gray. So how might we actually use this in an image? Well, let's have a look at that now. So let me just get rid of this dodgy blue layer. So let's suppose we've got this rock over here in the distance, and we want to apply a curves adjustment that is going to brighten it up. So let's add a curves adjustment to the image and just simply brighten it. I'll exaggerate the effect just for the purpose of the demo. You're probably not going to want to do quite as an extreme brightening adjustment as this in one hit. So we would create the curves adjustment, brighten, make the adjustment, and then invert the mask. So Command or Control I. So this basically conceals the adjustment. Now, without using a luminosity mask, let's grab a white brush and usually use an opacity of, I like to stick around 30% on the brush. So without using a luminosity mask, if we wanted to actually use this curves adjustment and reveal it on this dark rock over here, then it's going to be really difficult making that much of an accurate, doing an accurate job basically, because you've got a really detailed edge. There's the risk of going over the edge into the sky. That's going to create a halo. Or if you play it safe and you don't go all the way up to the edge, then you're going to end up with dark edges around any objects that you've been masking. So I'll just undo that. Now, what we want is a luminosity selection that's going to isolate the shadows in the image so that I can brush through it to make sure that the brush only affects those shadows. So let's come over into the channels panel. And let's have a look at our shadows 1 selection or channel. So this is a good start because we can see there's a good isolation between the white rock and the sky. However, because the sky isn't pure black, it's not going to restrict it 100%. So we need to actually create a bit more contrast between the rock and the background. There's a few ways of doing that. The first would be just to basically intersect the shadow selection with itself. Don't worry about the terminology. It can get a bit confusing, but essentially the steps to perform that would be to load it as a selection. So Command or Control, click on S1. And now to intersect it with itself, we're holding Command Option Shift on a Mac, Control Alt Shift on a PC. And hopefully you can see there the mouse cursor, when we hover over the channel, has now become a finger with a square and an X in it. If you see that, then it's going to do what you want. So we'll click that once now, and you'll see the marching ant kind of changed, and it looks like it's kind of honed in on those shadows a bit more. So let's look at what this selection actually looks like when we save it as a new channel. So let's hit the Save Selection as Channel button here, Alpha 1. So let's call this Shadows 2, S2. And now you can see the difference between S1, which is a lower contrast shadow selection. There's more grays in the sky. Shadows 2, we've increased that contrast, and that's going to give us more of a defined selection to brush through. So if we brush over in the water here, that's still going to apply some of the brush stroke just in the water there in the foreground, because that's not as pure a black. But the sky is pretty good. So let's use this for this example. So we've got this selection active already. Let's come back into the RGB channel, back over into layers. Let's click on the layer mask for this curves adjustment. And I'm just going to bump it up, the brush opacity up to 100% just to show you exactly why this is, it's just going to show it to you in a lot clearer. So I can now brush pretty much starting from way outside of the selection, way outside of this rock. I can start my brush stroke here, sweep it across the rock, and now the brush is only being applied within that selection, therefore creating a really nice halo-free brightening effect along the edge of, more importantly, along the edge of the rock. So what we can now actually do, if I deselect this, Command or Control D, we can toggle this off and on, and we can see that's pretty much, I mean, we can tidy it up a little bit more around the front here, but as far as the rock against the sky, goes, that's a pretty flawless edge to that layer mask. And if we hold Alt or Option on the keyboard and click on the mask, we can see this is what the mask looks like. And it's got that perfect definition around all of those edges. And so, in essence, this is the crux of luminosity masking. So, it's all about creating those selections that isolate the tonal range that you want to adjust, and then making your adjustment, and then brushing through your selection to reveal that adjustment in only those areas that you want it to be applied. So I mentioned that there's other things that you can do. Well,
Steve,
there's actually other tasks.
Quick question,
not just
Steve.
brushing. Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
We've got a question here from the audience, which is a really good question actually, and I'm sure you're going to have a great answer for it. When trying to isolate that rock, why not just use the quick selection tool? I'll let you answer that without sort of prefacing it at all.
Yeah, sure. Well, if there is an edge with good contrast, then that can work. The quick selection tool is a valid option. However, there's not always it's not always going to be as accurate, and it's not always going to work as well. So yeah, when you're working with the tonal ranges to create your selection, it just gives you more leeway. This example here is a good example because there is already some fairly decent contrast. But yeah, it's basically, you can use the quick selection tool if you've got a really well-defined edge, but sometimes Photoshop's just not going to pick up that edge how you want it to. So that's when this extra level of granularity can sort of come into play. Like, for example, let's say...
And pure speed as well, Steve, right? Because quick selection, as good as it is going to take, 10, 15 seconds to produce that mask. Whereas with your panel, how long would that take to pick up that mask? If with a little bit of experience, you'd have that mask in a couple of seconds, would you not?
Yeah. So, without the panel, it's already pretty quick. If you're willing to sort of put in a bit of practice and get used to the controls and what's happening in the channels panel here and kind of replicating what I've shown here. In the panel, I've got it open just here. This is where I have it. We've got this luminosity selections bar that goes from 5 on the left. It goes 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0 in the middle, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you want to create a shadows 2 selection, which is what we used just now, let me just hide this for a sec. Let's turn the previews on. So there's an option to do this with or without previews. You can literally just hit the shadows 2 button, and that's created the same exact selection. So this is a preview of the selection. And then if we're happy to use it as is, then we can hit use mask, and that loads that selection. So, there's a quicker way of doing it. The panel is basically, I've built it to shortcut all of the sort of long-winded processes involved with creating selections the long way. But if you're familiar, if you spend a bit of time learning the processes manually, then it can still be quick. But yeah, the panel's there. It can make. I designed it to make things quicker and easier, really.
Yeah.
So let me just show you another example, actually, a bit more of a subtle example, where quick selection wouldn't work. So let me just get rid of this curves adjustment. Now, let's add another levels adjustment, or let's use the levels this time. And let's add some contrast with this. So I'm gonna, this is actually my preferred way of adding contrast. I like the levels adjustment, and I'll just tweak these 2 points here, just drag them closer towards each other to create some contrast. Now, what we have here, there's nice, it's added a nice pop of contrast. This is already a finished image, so it's probably a bit too contrasty now. But there are tonal ranges where this works. Like, it actually looks pretty good in the shadows. And up here in the sky, I like what it's done. It's kind of made that little bit of pink cloud pop a little bit more, but it has overexposed all of these whites in the middle. Now, if we wanted to recover those whites, then, yeah, if we wanted to do that using a luminosity mask, then you would come into the channels panel and load a, well, we've already got the highlights 1 channel created. So let's use this to create a highlights 2 or even a 3. So I'm going to load highlights 1, Command or Control, click on H1. And now we'll intersect this with itself to then create that higher contrast version. So Command, Option, Shift or Control, Alt, Shift, click on it again. So this will create a highlights 2 if we now save this. Okay, that'll probably do us. Deselect, let's just rename this to H2 just so we know where we are. Okay, let's use this now to basically recover or repair those broken highlights. So Command or Control, click on H2, back over into our layers, click on the mask for this adjustment that overexposed those whites. Now this time we're going to want to use a black brush because we want to conceal this adjustment. Let's bring it down to 30-something% again on the brush opacity. And make the brush a bit bigger. So I'm just going to hide these marching ants because they get in the way. So I'm going to press on a keyboard Command or Control and H. So that's going to hide the ants. The selection is still active, however. So if I brush through here now in the foreground in this section, then what's actually happening, if we look at the mask, we can see that we've actually, like, where they're the most overexposed, that's where the brush is going to be applied the most. So it's a good way to recover in the foreground there, and then the same up here in the sky. Like we've got some colors that it looks like certain color channels have overexposed, perhaps not all, but using this selection, which is still active, I can brush through here to recover those overexposed colors without any threat of accidentally brushing down here into the water where I don't want to be removing this effect. And now, so that's what that's what the mask looks like here. So it's a very gradual way of repairing overexposed highlights in this way. And yeah, to bring it back to the quick selection tool, I don't think there would be a way of creating a single two-dimensional selection that can isolate only those bits you want to recover that have been overexposed.
No, not with that kind of accuracy, mate. Not at all.
So yeah, so that's a couple of the added benefits, really. And yeah, like I said, there's heaps of ways, that you can use these luminosity selections. The most commonly used and talked about way is to mask, to create luminosity masks from them. Actually, before we move on, there was one other note I almost forgot to mention. There is another way to apply a luminosity selection to an adjustment. So what we've shown you here so far is brushing through an active selection to selectively brush in or out whatever we want to brush in or out. However, if you wanted to make an adjustment and you know that you only want to make it in the highlights of an image, then what you can do is back over in the channels panel, you can load whatever channel you want to load as a selection. So let's take the highlights one, Command or Control H to load it. Back over into our layers panel, and if you've got this action, if you've got this selection active, when you add an adjustment, then that adjustment gets created with that that whole layer mask applied. So this is it's taking that H1 selection that we loaded and loading it directly into the layer mask. So now what you can do, and you can see here as well, the histogram in the curves properties, whatever we do here with the curves adjustment is only going to affect that top half of the histogram. So now if you wanted to darken it, we can darken it quite a long way, and you can see the shadows aren't being affected at all.
Nice.
We can increase the brightness and the shadows aren't being affected at all, or we can use it to increase contrast in that particular area without worrying about what's happening down here. That's a good way of that's another quick way to use luminosity masking, just to isolate adjustments and layers to a particular tonal range.
Steve, often when we enter a photo competition, one of the most prominent feedback notes is mid-tone contrast lacking. So I imagine you could do a mid-tone contrast boost, could you not, with luminosity masks relatively easily?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's a little bit convoluted, but again, once you sort of know the steps and once you've used them a few times, you can actually run through them in a few seconds. In this, let's use this image still as an example. So to create a midtones mask, one that's going to restrict any contrast adjustment to the midtones only, we've already done most of the legwork actually by creating these highlights and shadows selections. So let's use those, let's recycle those. Now the way you would do it is first select from the channels panel, click on the RGB channel and select the entire channel, so Command or Control A. So we can see we've got the marching ants around the whole image.
I see where you're going, yep.
Now what we can do is subtract the highlights and subtract the shadows from this, and that's going to leave the midtones.
Yep.
So it's better actually to use the deeper, the shadows and highlights selections that we created that have gone a little bit deeper than just those first H1 and S1s. So let's use the S2 and H2. So to subtract from this entire image, so on the keyboard, it's Command Option on a Mac or Control Alt on a PC. And now we can see the cursor has got that minus symbol inside the square. So that means we're going to subtract the S2 channel when I click on it from the RGB channel. So I'll do that. And now I'll do the same thing on H2. So Command Option or Control Alt, subtract H2. And now let's save this currently active selection as a new channel and get rid of the marching ants. And this is now midtones. So we can see this is a mostly gray, weird kind of funny looking thing.
It looks terrible.
but what it's, if we load this as a selection now, what this is doing, you notice both the brightest, so the brightest parts of the sky there,
yes, and
the darkest parts of the foreground are all black.
Yep.
So that means what's left is the midtones. So if we load this as a selection, Command or Control, click on that channel, back over into layers. Now if we add a curves adjustment, the midtones selection is now loaded directly into the layer mask for this curves adjustment. Mm-hmm. And now we can make any adjustments here.
Oh, nice.
And they will be masked out automatically from the highlights and shadows, leaving only the midtones. So this is basically a midtone contrast boosting adjustment. So just another quick reminder there, you've got the dark shadows and the brightest highlights have been masked out.
And you can see that in the histogram again, Steve, can't you, pretty much? When that
Yep. So there's still, it's closer to the right-hand side of the histogram there. But yeah, you can see the shadows because, I mean, the image itself is there's more shadows than highlights.
And you could adjust that piece of the histogram depending on which segments you subtracted from that original mask anyway, couldn't you, Steve?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, if you went all the way down into like shadows 5 to really only isolate the very, very darkest shadows, and
Uh-huh.
the highlights 5 to isolate the very brightest highlights, then yeah, you could do that.
Yeah. No, that's all right. That's awesome, Steve. I love it.
Sure.
Sandra Dan has asked, she is curious whether this is best for your more natural images like you've got here, or would it also be useful for, compositing and illustrative type photography?
I don't think it's restricted to any particular genre, to be
Yeah, I
honest.
don't think so.
If there's ever any scenario when you're editing an image where you want to make an adjustment to a particular tonal range, then this is perfect for it.
I got a great
So yeah.
example, actually, Steve. Imagine we had a big, beautiful, lush green tree, and you wanted to
Mm-hmm.
maybe change that to a different color, even with a hue slider. I'd imagine you could use a luminosity mask to isolate essentially the dark leaves on the tree against the bright sky, and then maybe change it from green to red or orange, couldn't you? Really?
Yeah, potentially. If you've got that definition in tonal range between the tree and its background, then that would work great.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, should we move on to an exposure blending example?
Let's do it, mate. Yeah, let's do it.
Yep. All right, sweet. So I've got this image over here. So this was a previously edited image. I've turned all of the edits off and just reset the layer masks so that we can show using these same techniques to actually blend exposures now. So where are we? Have I reset everything? Yep. Now, when I blend exposures, I like to start with the middle exposure and then blend in the bits from the other two that are going to be most useful. So starting from this middle exposure and then blending in the sky from the darker exposure, and then maybe using some of this bright exposure for the foreground. Now there's a bit of a trick that you can use. So let's say we want to blend the sky from the dark exposure into this middle exposure. We're not restricted to only creating a mask from one of these two exposures. The fact that the sky in this bright exposure is virtually white means that it's a really good candidate for actually basing a luminosity mask from this channel, from this exposure. So we'll create the selection first using this with this layer active, and then we'll turn it off and do our blend. So over into the channels panel, I'm going to create a highlight selection by Command or Control clicking on RGB. We'll save it as a selection. Save the selection as a channel. Click on Alpha 1 and Command D just to deselect. Now, another trick that you can do actually, that you can use if you want to increase contrast without that whole intersection business, it will produce a different result. And if you go too far with this, it can look a bit, the edges can be a bit less defined than you might want. But a quick adjustment that you can do directly into this alpha channel is with the levels adjustment from the image adjustments menu. And so now, actually, my zoom control panel is just in the way now. So 1 sec.
Oh, we can see it. You can't. We can.
So yeah, what you can do is you can increase the contrast in this channel with the levels adjustment. So making the mountain darker in comparison to the bright sky behind it, just with the levels adjustment there. And that's going to be applied directly into the alpha channel. Click OK. And now we can use this as the basis for our selection. So let's come back over into layers. Let's turn off this top layer. And let's come back to channels. Let's load our alpha channel. Command or Control, click on Alpha 1. Back over into layers. And now on this middle exposure, I'm going to take a black brush on 30% opacity roughly. I'm just going to reduce the view so that I can kind of come in from outside of the frame and just sort of sweep the brush around. And as I brush along here and into the sky, you should see the sky getting darker.
Yeah.
Because that's what's being revealed from the layer beneath, because we're masking out this middle exposure. Just get a bit of the lake as well. Just need to make sure that our reflections don't end up brighter than the things they're reflecting. So if I deselect this now, we can see that before this layer mask, we had the bright overexposed sky. And now we've got the sky partially blended in from the layer beneath. And now if we look at the mask itself, we can see the definition along the edge of the mountain there. That, you know, because, you know, going back to the stencil analogy, because the mountain was so dark, it was blocking a lot more of the brush as we were brushing through the selection. And therefore in the layer mask, it's only very gradually painting into those areas, you know, in the mountain, whereas it was allowing me to brush a lot more strongly in the sky to create a pretty natural looking blend. Now, to do the same thing with the foreground, I mean, depending on the image, as I say, you don't always need to use luminosity masks. You might decide that you can, you know, you don't want to go all the way up to the edges of something. So for example, if you don't need to mask all the way up to the edge of the mountain, you might just want to mask the middle of the lake here, so you can get away with not using a luminosity selection. But let's do it anyway, just to demonstrate. So first, to brush in the parts of this layer that we want to use, first we need to mask the whole thing out. So Command or Control I to invert the layer mask. And now this time we need to isolate the shadows so that I can brush into the mountain without affecting the sky. Okay, so we can basically just now invert this alpha 1 channel that we created, and that's going to give that to us. So I'll duplicate it, I'll invert it, and now if I load this as a selection, Command or Control click, back over into the layers, onto the layer mask now with a white brush, I can now brighten the mountain, and I can brush all the way over the edge of the sky. The sky's not being affected. You know, it's giving me that definition that I can just brush all the way along here and reveal the lighter layer in this area. Now, where the snow on the mountain over there is, you know, that's going to create a bit of a tricky scenario for us to work on. But yeah, the crux of it here is that, yeah, we're able to brighten that dark mountain by brushing through that shadow selection that isolates our brush strokes. Now it looks a bit washed out here because I've probably brushed through a bit more of the light layer than I would normally, but yeah, for the sake of the demonstration, it kind of, yeah, proves the point anyway. So yeah, that is the basics of luminosity masking for blending exposures. You know, just to sort of summarize really, the main idea that I tend to use and that I follow is just to start from your middle exposure. Assuming you've got 3 exposures, you'll modify the approach depending on how many you've got, obviously. But if you've got 3 exposures, start with the middle exposure and then mask in any overexposed parts using the dark layer, and then mask in any underexposed parts using the bright layer. And to make sure that you've got good definition and you're not brushing over the edges and creating halos from, brushing too much beyond the edges that you want to be brushing, then your luminosity selections are what's going to give you that.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of quick questions here, mate. There's one from Janice that says, was Steve painting a white brush over I think she says over a white mask for the sky. But to just clarify again why you would use a black brush on a white mask or a white brush on a black mask, Steve?
Yeah, so it can get confusing because when you're brushing through these selections, it's actually the opposite of how the mask ends up looking. So yeah, let's go back to the sky example. So if I wanted to brush the dark sky in, so I was starting off with the pure white mask, and to conceal this bright layer to reveal the layer beneath it, the dark layer.
Yes.
I need to brush with a black brush into this layer,
yes,
to conceal this layer. Now, I think the confusing part is the fact that the mask or the channel that I'm using to create that selection, actually the sky is white because that's the part we want to brush into, but I'm using a black brush to brush into the mask, so it's creating something with the opposite look. So maybe that's where the confusion is, if there's any confusion, or maybe I just didn't explain it very well.
No. I think you've explained it quite well. It is kind of confusing, but once you I think you need to have a general understanding of how layers, masks, and the black and white brush work initially before really delving into luminosity masks, correct? This is more an intermediate, advanced level masking system. And to get the most out of it, you should understand how the mask works initially, I would imagine.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, really, this is kind of layer masking 2.0.
Yeah.
So, if once you're happy and familiar with how layer masks work in general, then this is basically just going to add to that. It's, I say that it kind of supercharges your layer masks. So, you'd have a hard time using luminosity masks if you've never really used layer masks before.
Yeah,
I think. But yeah, I mean, there's, a basic understanding is probably enough to start dabbling, I would say.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know it's there. It has tremendous benefit. But yeah, I think get some foundation in your Photoshop layers and masks first of all, and an understanding of how a white mask works versus a black mask, and the brushes black and white as well. A couple other questions. Tracy asks, does Steve find that when the peaks have snow, like this image here, can the luminosity mask bleed into the snow? And I guess sometimes, Steve, that bleeding into the snow is a good thing because the snow is probably too bright sometimes too. Would that be correct?
Yeah, so that's a good question for this image because it is a specific thing that I had to deal with when editing the image for myself before today. In cases like that where so what have we got? So this, let's say in theory, this is our blended image. Let's reduce the opacity of this. Let's go back to the alpha 1. Yeah, okay. So if we wanted to, if we wanted to exclude the snow here from the selection, then we would basically, what I do is, modify this channel, perhaps even using the quick selection tool or some other selection tool, or even use the dodge and burn tools to modify the channel. Because it's not like, it doesn't discriminate between objects, it only discriminates between brightness.
Tones,
this whole idea. So if we wanted to create a selection that that we can use for the sky, but that doesn't touch the mountain, then I mean, it's extra tricky here because there's fog as well that's blurring the edge.
Yeah, that can be tricky, absolutely.
But let's see. So I mean, I'm not sure the quick selection tool might get us close. maybe. You might have to clean up some halos after the fact. So, you might be able to create a selection like that, and then we can use the burn tool. Let's see how extreme we can go. So you can use the burn tool on the highlights to then darken it.
Oh yeah.
But then because of the quick selection, like if you deselect it now, you've got kind of like a weird edge.
Yeah.
So I might, I mean, I've done heaps of brush strokes here. I'm trying to undo them. Hang on. Yeah, so something like this, it is tricky. Like compare that to over this side where it's not white. I mean, the dodge and burn tool is a great tool to use if you want to, increase the contrast there as well. So you can use the levels adjustment, like I mentioned, but you can also, if we want to burn the shadows, you can do that along the edge to make it perfectly black without touching the sky there as well. So you can do all kinds of things to modify your alpha channels before loading them as a selection.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like this particular image and this snow-capped mountain with the fog on it is a particularly difficult scenario, which it's probably going to require a lot of messing around. Or you could just go the other way, and when you get to that bit, just make some kind of adjustment and mask it in or out, kind of like
back in
with
or
a
back
bigger
out,
brush to soften the effect.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's my answer.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could. The brush is going to do a pretty good job there anyway, and you probably want a little bit of feather bleed down into there most of the time anyway. A quick grayer masks, and we might do something later on, Steve. Grayer masks. Does Steve have a view about the differences between blend if and luminosity? And what we might do, what do you think about if you've got time in say a couple of weeks? If we get a couple of 100 likes on this video, maybe we can come back and we'll do a blend if versus luminosity mask. So you choose 2 or 3 images.
Fight.
A bit of a royal rumble.
Yeah.
If you choose a couple of images and show me a technique, and then I'll try and replicate with blend if, and then I might do a technique and you can replicate with luminosity. Essentially, I mean, I'll leave it to you. Essentially, they're very, very similar. They are the most powerful tools that Photoshop has as far as masking is concerned, luminosity and blend if. They can be used in conjunction as well. But maybe, what do you think about that, Steve? We do a bit of a comparison in the future at some stage.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of fun.
Put you on the spot,
I mean, to be
mate.
honest, I'll be keen to learn a bit more about blend if myself from you. So,
I mean, I know you mentioned it to me yesterday. To answer the question, do you have an opinion on the differences or the similarities between the two?
So, yeah, when we had a quick chat yesterday, I sort of also mentioned that a few weeks ago, I kind of had an idea for a video to record for my own channel, where it was going to be, blend if that is not the same. I came up with a title before I figured out if it was going to be true or not. So I came up with the title, blend if is not the same as luminosity masks. So I spent about half an hour actually trying to learn a bit about blend if, because I'm a bit ignorant in that technique.
Yeah.
And there weren't many scenarios that I couldn't find a way to achieve the same result. I think so. Like Photoshop, I mean, everything in Photoshop has got multiple ways of achieving the same result. I think the main difference between blend if and using luminosity selections, as I've shown today, would be that for one, you have a lot more control over, like, say for example, you wanted to blend a particular adjustment in the highlights of an image. You can do that with a blend if slider. That's fine. And you can do that with luminosity masks. But if you wanted to blend it in the highlights only in the top corner of an image, then it's probably going to be quicker and easier using luminosity masks.
Yeah.
Whereas you could achieve the same end result using blend if, but then you're going to have to create your adjustment, do the blend if slider to narrow it down to your tonal range, and then mask afterwards with like a regular brush without using the luminosity selection.
Yeah.
So I would imagine, it's pretty much you can achieve the same results. It's just a case of which way around you prefer doing it, I guess.
Yeah, we'll find out. We'll find out, Steve.
Yeah, and I think actually you reminded me that there's probably, I think when you start subtracting channels from other channels to create kind of hybrid tonal ranges, I don't know if that's something you could do with blend if, for example.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
To create one adjustment with a layer mask that isolates an adjustment, say for some reason you wanted to have that adjustment only applied to the shadows and to the highlights at the same time, without the midtones. That's something you could do with luminosity masking, or
you can do it with blend if as well. That sounds like fun. We'll do that little challenge. Essentially they are just different ways of doing the same thing. There are some subtleties that one maybe can do and the other can't, and we'll see if we can discover those. But essentially, as you said to me this morning, Steve, luminosity works like more of a stencil, or as you made that example earlier, whereas you're painting through a stencil, whereas with blend if you tend to paint on first and then apply the stencil afterwards, essentially, and pull it back out of those different tonalities. So it's kind of the same thing, but you just go about it in a slightly different combination of steps. But yeah, if you're up for it, we'll come back on and we'll do another one. But before, I don't want to let you go yet, because you showed me a quick brief run through on your panel yesterday, and it's got a whole bunch of things, including generating luminosity masks and subtracting luminosity masks, but you've also got some other fun things in there as well. Can you give us a quick demo on first of all, how the panel makes luminosity masks easier, and just give us a run through of the other little features you've got built in there as well?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so thanks for the opportunity, Ed. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So basically the luminosity panel, I created it essentially just as a way to shortcut a lot of the manual process of creating these channels and selections. So the main functionality compared to what we've been showing you today can be found just up here in the luminosity selections section. So we've got this panel. I described it briefly before, but we've got shadows on this left-hand side, highlights on the right-hand side. And you can, if we turn the previews on, you can quickly generate shadows 5, shadows 4, shadows 1. There's a midtones. Takes a little bit longer. We're still there, I think.
Yeah, we're still here. It's just just let that come up. We can't see the midtones just yet.
No, I think this is my computer rather than.
Oh, okay. Right.
Don't know what's going on.
I'm getting the old freeze, the old Photoshop freeze. See, technology, Steve. The gremlins are here.
Yeah, there we go. That was, well, at least it waited until the end to show up. Okay. Might have to restart Photoshop here.
Yeah, do a restart.
Here we go. There we go.
Oh, we're back.
My computer is about 5 years old, so maybe it was just struggling. So there we've got a midtones mask, and then we can go into the highlights and whatnot. You can pick quite quickly and easily and generate these selections. And then if you want to use one, you just hit the use mask button. And then if you wanted to apply it to a curves adjustment, you can just add the adjustment, and then that gets loaded into the mask. Or if you wanted to just load it really quickly, you can turn the previews off. Like if you know that you only want to adjust the shadows in a particular adjustment, you can just quickly hit the shadows 5, and it will just load the selection.
Yeah.
And it's there and ready to use. Now you can do adding and subtracting as well. So if we turn the previews on again so we can see this, if I was to preview a shadows 5, so this is a selection that isolates the darkest shadows. Let's now add the brightest highlights to this selection. We'll check the add box there, and then let's hit the highlights 5. So now we're going to add this selection to the previous selection. So adding the brightest, the sky there and the mountain. Click apply, and now that's going to add those two selections together. So we've got something that, we've got the shadows and the highlights without the midtones in that same selection. And then, we've got quick shortcuts down here as well to the levels adjustment if you wanted to do that, to adjust the contrast as I demoed earlier. Or you've got some buttons here to sort of quickly make the brighter parts brighter or the darker parts darker. You can do that. You can actually invert it as well. But yeah, I mean, this is all stuff that you can do in Photoshop. It's just this is tapping into Photoshop's functionality. It's not adding anything like a plugin would do.
Makes life faster.
But it's just making it quicker and easier, really. So let me just cancel that, and I'll run you through just real quick. The 16-bit masking, there's an extra section here. I added it because a lot of people were asking about 16-bit masks. It's probably a topic for another day if we get into the difference between 8-bit and 16-bit masking. But essentially, it's actually a pretty quick and easy section of the panel, and it can be quite handy. So let's suppose, for example, we wanted to brighten the image. So we're just recycling this curves adjustment. You actually have to hit the Create All button first before we use any of these. But once those channels have been created, if we actually look over in the channels panel, we've got all of these highlights, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, shadows and midtones. So they're pre-generated now. And we can use any of these buttons to now apply this, to apply one of those masks to this adjustment. So we can just hit H1. So that now you can toggle between highlights, midtones, shadows.
Oh, cool.
Shadows 2, shadows 3, highlights 1, highlights 2, highlights 3, 4, and so on.
Yeah.
So if you're not interested in, if you've got adjustments that you just want to apply to broad tonal ranges, then you can use this, and it's pretty handy if you're not going to be brushing, using the masks for brushing through. And the reason is because as soon as you create, if you create a 16-bit channel, as soon as you load it as a selection, Photoshop converts every selection to 8-bit. So that's why 16-bit masks have to be applied directly into a layer mask, because they can't be added via being loaded as a selection first. But anyway, as I said, that's a pretty big topic that we probably don't want to get into today. But then, just further on down the panel, there's a few other little shortcuts that I created just for sort of, let me just extend this a little bit, just for some other common tasks you might want to do. So for example, we've got a curves adjustment that adds contrast. So under the light section here, we've got some curves and levels adjustments that just add contrast, but there's also a button if you wanted to add a contrast curve to the shadows, then it comes with the mask preloaded. That's just a one-click thing, or you can load it to the midtones.
Oh, yeah.
Just some real quick shortcuts there for some contrast adjustments. And you've got the same for levels as well. You've got 3 different methods of adding contrast via a levels adjustment, and then the shadows, midtones, and highlights just loads it with the mask selected, with the mask active already. So this one is adding contrast to the shadows. And then, same story over here. We've got lightening and darkening adjustment layers. So if you want to brighten the image with a curves adjustment in the shadows, you can just hit the S there. And there you go. That's like a one-click luminosity adjustment. With that mask applied. And then let's close that. So we've got some other color adjustments here. We've got a color correction. I built this in, but I don't use it that much myself because I like photographing at sunrise and sunset, and the last thing I want to do is correct those colors.
Pull the warmth out.
I don't want to get rid of all those nice warm sunset colors.
Absolutely.
But yeah, that's an option if you've got an image that needs to have good color correction, and then just some warming filter and a cooling filter and a blue sky filter, which can be used mostly to saturate like a daytime clear sky. And then we've got some effects down here. I use this one quite a lot myself, actually. I use the Autumn effect quite a lot in my own workflow. So I've got a one-click button that will apply the Autumn effect.
A little bit of a glow blur, is it?
Yeah, exactly. So once that finishes processing, it comes with a black layer mask, and then you can mask it in or do whatever you want to. But what I actually like doing is combining it with a highlights adjustment. So if I just invert the mask, so we've got the Autumn effect in full strength here.
Yeah, nice and paintedly.
So I actually quite like just having it in the highlights.
Sure.
So yeah, that's a quick, just saves a bunch of steps in your workflow if that's something that you use a lot. And then just some other effects here. I've got some videos on my channel, so I won't drag this out too long on this live show. That just sort of describes these in a bit more detail. But we've got some dodging and burning shortcuts. So if you want to add a 50% gray layer to do some dodging and burning on, it's just a quick shortcut there. Or we've got the same thing if you wanted to add a 50% gray layer with the shadows luminosity mask applied.
Yeah, sure.
Then you got that, so you can dodge and burn the shadows separately. We've got a sharpening button over here, which uses the high pass filter for sharpening, but then it adds a luminosity mask to eliminate any over sharpening kind of halo-y effects in the highlights.
Yep.
So it sort of picks up those crunchy edges of where high pass filter can sometimes cause some dodgy sharpening.
Yeah. I like the look of that button. Cloud, does that say cloud dramatizer?
Cloud dramatizer.
So
let's hit that, see what it does.
I need that button.
So basically it is another high pass filter layer, but on a much, much higher pixel value than you would use for sharpening. And it basically adds contrast, but then again, it comes with a black layer mask for you to then brush in the effect.
Oh yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
So it's kind of coming through. It'd work a bit better on if I'd processed this image a little bit more before using it. And then finally, output for web. I just got some shortcuts here. There's two buttons, 960 and 2048. Those are the resolutions that Facebook, if you upload an image to Facebook and it doesn't look as good as it did on your computer, it's because you didn't upload it at one of those 2 pixel widths. Or you can type in whatever you want there and hit the custom button, and it will duplicate the image, resize it, sharpen it, add a little bit of blur before the sharpening, but it's all in a smart filter, so you can adjust that or remove that part if you wanted to get rid of that blur. It's just a little effect that I think looks quite nice.
Nice.
And that's a real quick summary of the panel.
Yep. And Steve, there was an offer that I put in the description yesterday, $40 off, which gets you this panel. And tell me, there's some videos that go with the panel and explain how this all works in a bit more detail? Is there, or what do you? Yeah,
exactly. So the panel actually on the page on the order form, there's a video that runs through most of it. Yep. I created that video before I added the 16-bit masking section, so that's not described on here. But I published some videos last week actually to my channel which walk through this section, and basically about 80%. So I've got 4 parts of a 5-part series up already.
Yep.
There's some of my most recent videos from last week on YouTube. But the whole point of me creating this was because I just wanted to make luminosity masking easier for everybody. Because although I do have a course that teaches it, I think it can be a lot easier, and a lot of people, even people who take the course, end up not wanting to use it just because it is a process that takes time, or it can take time if you're not using it all the time. Like if it's something, the casual user might only be processing images once a month, and then you have to kind of relearn everything every time you pick up Photoshop. So I just wanted to make it easier, and one of the criteria that I gave myself when making the panel was that I didn't want to have to create a 6-hour course to teach you how to use the panel. So,
exactly.
It's with a basic understanding of luminosity masking, and just more selections, really, just the idea of loading selections, treating them as a stencil. With that basic understanding, then I think you can use the panel and get a lot from it, and it will just make the whole process easier.
100%, mate, 100%. So guys, check out in the description below, discount. I think the code is Adam. Make sure it's all in caps lock, all in uppercase. Just to let you know, just full disclosure, I'm not getting any kickbacks. I think it's a great product. Steve is an incredible teacher, and he's been very experienced in Photoshop and very generous to come on here and tell us all about it. Obviously, you don't have to go and buy that panel, but if you're interested in luminosity masking, it's probably going to make life a little bit easier just to have those one-click buttons to generate those masks. But absolutely up to you. You can go around it the other way. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for coming on and joining us. That was incredible. I'm going to have to, go away and have a little play with luminosity masks on my photos and see the differences that I can find between that and Blend If. But yeah, in the next coming weeks, guys, if you really want to see us do a little bit of a head-to-head example of Blend If and luminosity masks, and see if we can discover the similarities or the maybe even the differences between the two, then hit that like button. If we get to 200 likes, as soon as we get to 200 likes, I'll jump on the phone to Steve and we'll organise a date to come back on and do a bit of a Royal Rumble Blend If versus luminosity masking, which should be fun. Steve, thanks again. Is there anything else you wanted to add? I'll just check for some questions while you wrap that up there.
Just just want to say thanks for having us on. Hopefully this went smoothly, and I was worried about my internet connection because we're still stuck on ADSL. I can't believe it. We haven't got fiber yet. But thanks again, Adam. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and show you guys some luminosity masking, and
it's been great. It's been popular. Apparently, the guys are telling me we've got 200 concurrently watching right now. So if everyone now that is watching right at this very moment hits the like button, I think we've already got 100 and something odd likes. So if you just hit that like button, well, maybe I'll do the Royal Rumble Blend If versus luminosity. We'll do it in the next couple of weeks. We'll organise it straight away. But once we get to 200 likes, I'll jump on the phone to Steve. Thanks, mate. Thanks so much for your time and generosity and teaching us all a little bit about luminosity masking. Remember, guys, if you're interested in that, well, number one, jump over to Steve's YouTube channel, because he's got 100 free videos over there, and you can really get an understanding of what's going on potentially. And then jump on and grab that discount on the Photoshop panel. Steve, how long's that discount lasting for? A couple of days or?
What day is it today? Tuesday. Give it a couple of days probably, if that makes sense. Yeah,
so jump on Steve's channel, give him a subscribe, do a little bit of, have a look around there, see if you really want to invest in luminosity type panel and courses, and then come back here and you can find that link and coupon code in the description below. Steve, thanks, mate. We'll wrap it up there. Stay with me as I say goodbye. But thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And if you're new, thanks again for joining us, and hit the subscribe button. We do this at the moment. This week we're doing it every day. Next week we're back to Tuesday will be our Photoshop Fun Day, where we do Photoshop challenges and Photoshop tutorials and composites and all that good stuff. Thursday is going to be our Inspiration Day, where we get on some incredible photographers to talk about their work and inspire us to new heights. And then Friday, every second Friday, we're going to do photo critique if you're interested in the new makeup of what will happen from next week. All right, Steve, thanks again. Thanks everyone for watching along, and I'll see you tomorrow morning, same place, same time. Stay safe and well. I'll see you then. Bye for now. In that one. Oh, end.